So once again, I do want to welcome everyone to the Fair Pay for Northern California and Southern California Nonprofits, the 2024 Compensation and Benefits Survey. And today we'll be discussing some of the highlights and trends that came out of that survey. So our two speakers for today, we're very lucky to have Geoff Green, the CEO of Nonprofits, and Rita Haronian, the survey director of Nonprofit Compensation Associates, who has been a long time advocate for this survey and someone who has a wealth of knowledge along this topic to share with our community. So with that, I'll pass it over to Geoff and Rita.
Great. Thank you so much, Robert, and welcome everyone. I'll add my welcome to Robert's welcome. I think we're in the triple digits today. This is obviously a big topic for us in the sector. For CalNonprofits, it's also something that we work on at all levels. So there's a legislative component certainly to this, and a lot of the HR rules and regulations in the state of California is something we spend time on, helping folks understand what they're permitted to do, not permitted to do, when floors are set or new floors are set around the way that the nonprofit workforce is engaged. And this is something that we work on at a number of levels. But one of the biggest questions that we get, I know this personally, and I know most of our team gets this, is when someone is looking at either their own compensation, if you're an executive director negotiating with your board, or trying to expand or hire new folks, especially with the latest wave of turnovers in the sector, as well as literally all sectors, trying to peg that right compensation. So we are very happy today to have the person to whom I usually turn on these questions, and who's been a partner to us and actually to many of us probably on this call over many years. In fact, this morning I learned, I do want to share this, Rita told me I could, that she has been engaged in this survey in some form or other in all 41, save 2, of its years, 4 decades that this survey has been done in different forms, under different organizational homes. But it makes it one of, I'm just making this up and I'm declaring it to be true, but I can't prove it yet, that it is probably one of the oldest and most consistent surveys of compensation out there. So we are happy to share some of these highlights with you today. We are going to talk at a fairly high level about trends and what we're seeing. And we're going to talk a little bit about how to use and read the survey. If you have been a user of this survey, you will know that it is hundreds and hundreds of pages long. There's an incredible amount of information. There are 2 surveys, and I'm going to ask Rita here in a moment just to tell us a little bit about sort of that evolution of how we got to what we have today before we break into our first oversight or high-level look at some of the trends. So wonderful to have you here with us, Rita. Thank you so much for all you have done. I'm still kind of blown away by that 41 years, but would you just share a bit about the evolution of this survey and where we're at now and what we're looking at going forward?
Yes, and first, thank you, Geoff, Robert, CalNonprofits, for putting this together today and for being a great supporter of the survey for many years. The basic idea of the survey is to take a snapshot of the labor market in the nonprofit community as accurately as we can, so that people making decisions about compensation can set pay levels effectively, prioritize their resources. This all started, this project, at the Management Center in San Francisco many years ago. As Geoff said, it evolved over time, went through various incarnations. The Center for Nonprofit Management in Los Angeles was associated with the Management Center in some way. They were people in Los Angeles that we in San Francisco knew well, and they started the Southern California survey, which I also worked on for a number of years. CNM hasn't done that survey, I think, since 2018. And so a few years ago, I was getting a lot of requests from people in Southern California for this kind of information. And now my organization, Nonprofit Compensation Associates, conducts both Northern and Southern California surveys annually. So the information is meant to help you determine competitive pay levels for your organization's jobs. And competitive is an important word. It means in line with what other employers are paying for these jobs. So if you're looking to create or review a salary structure, looking at this sort of external labor market information is really important. Also looking at internal comparisons within your organization of how jobs within your organization relate to each other. That's also an important thing to consider. So the fair pay surveys that we're looking at today are, I think, especially valuable because they present local data. There are compensation surveys, I think some even nonprofit surveys that have much broader geographic scope. So you might see the Western US or California as a category. And given the first of all, the vastness of California, second of all, the really distinct employment markets within the state, that's not very helpful. So having, first of all, Northern California separate from Southern California is important. And also within those two regions, having some breakouts to cover distinct labor markets is also something that the survey really wants to do. So
Great.
I'm going to talk today about some trends in the main survey report. The effective date of this information is January 1st. The reports were published in April. First, I'm going to look at what we call economic environment questions to get a sense of how people are doing as we continue. We hope to come out of the most acute phase of the COVID-19 pandemic. And then we'll look at some more general trends. And where it's available, I've included some sort of historic data going back as many years as we have data for to sort of illustrate trends. At the end, you'll see my contact information. We really value comments and suggestions from nonprofit managers who use the survey. Every year, I go through the comments and suggestions. We always make adjustments to the content of the survey, whether it's adding new questions, revising questions, adding new jobs. We want the survey to be as comprehensive as possible. And at the same time, I have to also qualify it a bit. This is not the kind of survey that like a public opinion poll, for example, where they can say this information is accurate within X margin of error. We can't do that when it's a self-selected group, as this survey is. So it's not that kind of information, but we do cast as wide a net as possible. We work really hard to collect as much data as possible. And the result, I think, is valuable information for people who are making these kinds of decisions.
And Rita, if I can jump in and say that
Yes.
that's a really critical piece, and I'll make the pitch now and we'll make the pitch later. But this data is really coalition of the willing data. It's those who take the time to respond. We know that it is a workload to do that, and smaller organizations, of course, have a harder time carving out that time in a very busy mission-based workday. But I will say that the value of this is directly related to the size of the sample and the participants. So I know Rita will share a little bit about how it's evolved for Northern California's survey, but as a younger survey in Southern California, we're still trying to really build that momentum. So I will make a pitch to all of you here and all of your friends and anyone you can reach, that when we reach out again, and there are a lot of partners doing this alongside Rita's team, that we get as many folks in that number as possible. I also want to say we have a lot of information to go through today. And we've talked through this. I'm going to sort of guide the slides here as Rita shares what they say. We may go a little bit over, so I just want to tell folks now that we aim for 60 minutes, but that's 44.7 minutes from now. So we'll see what we could do, and we may go a little bit over that. So, all right.
Great.
Shall we go
Thank you.
first?
Yes.
I don't think any conversation about anything, as much as we'd like the pandemic to be in the rear view, can be had these days without something about the effects of the pandemic on our labor market. So
Right. And I think there's one slide before this. Yes. So we asked survey participants about the general impact on currently, meaning when they entered this information very early in 2024, the general impact of the pandemic. And we can see by 2023, the reported impact had noticeably decreased, even more so in 2024. A clear majority said slightly or not at all. This is not exactly a mirror image of July 2020. And July 2020 was a special additional survey that we conducted right when shortly after the pandemic had really hit, to see what organizations were doing and how people were coping. So July 2020, we see very significant, sometimes severe, moderate impacts of the survey. And the other thing I have to say is, for those who are still impacted, those impacts have changed over these few years. So for example, in the summer of 2020, layoffs, furloughs were not unusual, salary freezes. By early 2022, continuing into 2023 and this year, the impacts are more likely to be in the form of difficulty hiring and retaining staff, also formulating and adjusting policies about remote and hybrid work and the issues related to that. So the extent of impact has changed, and also what forms that impact takes has changed. Good. And so
All right, let's take a look here.
Move on. So here we have more information about remote, hybrid, and in-person work. We added this in 2022. And most organizations have some sort of hybrid combination of remote and in-person work for at least some of their employees. And you can see there are 4 broad categories of employees. And not surprisingly, people involved in direct program services are the most likely to be working exclusively in person. There seems to be a slight decrease in 2024 in the percentage of organizations with remote employees. Overall, the percentage of those with some hybrid employees really didn't change. There's an increase, even though it's a small increase, in those whose employees work exclusively or mainly in person. So not a big change in the last year, but some movement back to in-person work.
I think those subcategories are critical, because this is something, of course, that our sector deals with, and was really highlighted during the pandemic, which is that there's certain jobs that we do there's not a remote option, and a lot of human service, health work, and others, there's just community organizing work, there's just really not a remote option.
Right.
All right.
So we had some follow-up questions this year that we asked organizations that indicated that they had at least some remote or hybrid employees. 27% have required some to return in-person work since the beginning of the pandemic. 10% expect that some will be required to return to in-person work. And 55% of these organizations reimburse employees for at least some at-home work expenses. There's more detail about what kinds of expenses those are in the report. And most of these organizations say that when they're setting schedules, work schedules for their hybrid or remote employees, that that agreement is made collaboratively between the organization and the employee. And here on the next slide, there were also some questions that were asked only of organizations that indicate that they have remote employees. And one of the questions that I've heard, especially for the last few years, has been what people are doing about pay administration for remote employees, including the possibility of adjusting pay for some or all of them, This is a really interesting question. To my understanding, there hasn't really been a kind of best practices consensus that has emerged yet about whether to do this, how to do it, if you're going to do it. But among our survey participants in this group, 25% do adjust pay based on geographic cost of living differentials. So not certainly a majority, but a significant proportion of organizations are doing that. And also for this group, it's quite common for them to hire remote employees who live beyond commuting distance. So 56%, a little more than half. And even 41% indicate that they hire remote employees who live outside of the state of California. Now we're going to get into a few more slides addressing things that we've asked for a while in the survey. This slide, for example, this is a sort of an impact of the economic environment in terms of changes in benefits costs and also the workforce. We've asked these questions for quite a while. And this reflects sort of the, if I had to try to define an overall trend that I think shows up with the survey this year, this slide illustrates it. So the percentage of participants who anticipate increased competition for employees this year is 71%, which, while quite high, is slightly lower than what we saw in the last couple of years, 2022 and 2023. And in a similar way, fewer are especially concerned about turnover this year, about a third, so still a significant number, but it's gone down a bit compared to the last couple of years. And just under half say that they expect to be adding to their workforce this year. The other answers to that question don't appear on this slide, but half of them, about 50% said they expect their workforces to stay the same. And 46% said they expect them to grow. And that leaves just a very small percentage that expected their workplaces to decrease. And also that goes along with the fact that I hear very little concern about layoffs and furloughs these days. So it sort of fits the overall picture that I'm seeing of continued pressure regarding hiring employees, retaining employees, relatively high salary increases compared to what we've seen in previous years. We'll get to that in a minute, but just a bit lower than in 2022 and 23, and some continued pandemic fallout, as well as part of that is a continued focus on employee well-being. So we'll see those things crop up in a couple of different places in the slide.
Can you speak to that real outlier section in 2021? That seems to be the only real outlier of that.
That is the outlier.
Yeah.
So 2021 was the first year of the survey where we asked this question, where people were really grappling with dealing with the pandemic. And so, when that hit, and we know unemployment all of a sudden was highly elevated. So it wasn't so much an issue of finding employees and keeping them for employers, and less concern about turnover. They were more concerned about how to keep their organizations afloat, and just how they were going to get through it. So just as when we look at the unemployment sort of graph, there was this terrible spike in unemployment when the pandemic hit, and then compared to other recessions, for example, it came down quite quickly. So here 2021 is really the oddball kind of column in this picture. By 2022, again, people were quite concerned about hiring qualified employees and retaining them. and unemployment was going back down.
Great, thank you. All right, let's take a look at some DEI trends here that you've been tracking too.
Right. So this is a question that we added in 2022. And this slide shows responses over those 3 years to the initial question in the survey questionnaire, which is meant to get a sense about the extent to which organizations are working with DEI-related issues. And over that time, it appears that there's a modest, I think probably meaningful, but modest increase, especially looking at the line, DEI is a standing line item in the budget / policies implemented. So those organizations have implemented DEI policies that they've developed. That went from 13% in 2022 to 24% in 2024. In the survey report, there's more detail about all of this. We ask who among the staff is responsible, whether or not organizations have a committee or working group dedicated to DEI issues. If yes, who's on it? Have they or do they plan to work with a consultant? Does the board have a nominations process that takes into account DEI considerations? And also something about specific policies and practices that have been reviewed looking at DEI related issues. So we'll continue to ask about this and see how this looks over time. I think it'll be really interesting, especially given what we hear some in just general news accounts these days, some related to academic institutions about a sort of backlash to this.
It's very real. I think what struck me about these numbers, Rita, is that they're even at their peak, they're a fairly small minority of organizations that are answering affirmatively to the question. And I wonder, is some of that definitional? I mean, DEI is a relatively recent.
That's a really good question. And, you know, when we put together this group of questions, we hadn't done it before. And we always really try to design questions so that, first of all, they're clear and people can answer them accurately. They don't have to wonder whether they're answering them accurately or not, and also that they're gonna actually illuminate something for us. And so this has been, since it's a new group of questions, it's been sort of something that I've wondered how best to actually get a sense of what's going on. These sorts of categories of the degree to which organizations have been engaged in DEI work, that seemed to me to be a reasonable approach, but there may be a better way to do it. I'm not sure.
Yeah, no, I appreciate the data. All right, let's go to the next slide here.
Yeah, salary budgets, salary increase budgets. This is something that I get a lot of, not so much questions about, but interest in. So this goes back to the 2020 survey, which I want to point out, January 2020, this information was entered early in 2020, really for most people before pandemic impacts had hit. And so we see 90% of organizations giving regular salary increases at this time. And then by July, for that special pandemic economic impact supplement that we did, it was down to 61. And even then, these kinds of decisions about salary increases and what percent to give, how to determine them, can be sort of a lagging indicator for organizations because it takes a while to make these decisions and carry them out. So we don't necessarily see the impacts of something really dramatic like the pandemic. We don't necessarily see the impacts right away. But by July 2020, there was a very clear drop in the percentage of organizations that were looking at salary increases for essentially their current fiscal year. And then by 2021, even it was on its way back, not all the way back, but definitely on its way. By 2022, we were back to 89% of organizations, and it's held there. So 91% in 2023, 90% in 2024. To me, one of the really significant things here in this slide is that looking at the median percent increase reported among all organizations. So that means we line them up from the smallest number, including 0 here for those that are not giving increases, to the highest number. And the median means we pick the one in the middle. So for many years, 3% was the median that was reported by in the survey. I think back to 2004, 3% was the median. And so for the median to go, of course, not surprising, in July went down to 2%. But by 2022, the median went to 4%. And that was a number that we hadn't seen before. And 3% to 4%, in a way, it doesn't sound like a lot, but when you consider the impact on organizations when they're figuring out what their salary increases are going to be, it is significant. It stayed at 4% in 2023. This year, the median was 3.5%, which is one of the indicators that I mentioned before that I'm seeing of a somewhat softening of pandemic impact. So in 2022, 2023, that intense sort of pressure of what do we have to do to keep our employees? What do we have to do to hire people into these vacant positions? There is still that concern, certainly, but I see this movement to 3.5% as a median as an indication that that particular concern has softened a bit, though it's still higher than that sort of historic typical result of 3%.
Right. And we got some folks in the chat asking some questions about how this breaks out along COLA and merit and other things, and we're about to show you the answer.
Yes. Good. So we do ask about types of salary increases. So here for each survey year here, we have the percent of organizations that indicate that they consider this factor in formulating their salary increases. That's really sort of a policy question. And then the second column, the average increase. So this is the overall average increase that they reported. So for example, looking at 2024, 53% of our survey participants say that they look at merit/performance when determining salary increases. And the average increase, the average merit/performance increase reported by these organizations was 4.14%. So that doesn't mean that everyone got 4.14%, just that that was the average reported overall for these organizations. So here we see another indication of sort of recovery in 2022 and more in 2023, with a higher percentage of organizations considering increases of various types. And also in most cases, the actual percent of increase, that average, has increased as well. The 2024 numbers are very similar to 2023, with just slightly lower average increase rates for most of these 6 lines. And I want to say just quickly, the last 2 lines in this chart, external market and internal equity, those are special cases to some extent. These 2 types of increases tend to be targeted to specific jobs at an organization that the people running the organization have some reason to think may be out of alignment, based either on external labor market considerations, like survey data, for example, or internal job equity considerations within an organization. So the external market averages that we see here, and also internal equity averages, those are less likely to apply to a wide range of employees at an organization. They're more likely to be targeted to specific jobs. And again, I want to mention the importance of internal job equity. So the survey data is external labor market data. And as I said, we want to present a snapshot of the labor market to the in the most accurate way we can. But jobs at each organization are unique, even if they're similar enough so that they would be classified with the same survey job. There's still differences at one organization versus another. So it really is important to look at your jobs internally for equity and make sure that they relate to each other in a way that makes sense when making salary administration decisions.
Thanks, Rita. Looking at the external market, we had a attendee earlier inquiring in the chat about those pressures being and the competition being not just within the sector, or is it also external to the sector? And I know we have at least anecdotal evidence that there's competition now from far outside the nonprofit sector. Do you see evidence of that? I mean, that's obviously the highest, even though it's a narrower band of jobs, it's the highest average percentage of all of these.
Yeah. That is true and I think it has been true of jobs, administrative jobs, HR jobs, IT jobs. You may be hiring and competing with employers in any sector for those kinds of jobs. And certainly the public sector, some jobs we report in our survey, especially I hear about the challenge of hiring and retaining people because they could go to the public sector. For example, some housing related jobs, housing development jobs, some social services, program services jobs. There are similar jobs in the public sector. So I guess what I would say is just in principle, it's wise to consult a variety of sources when you're looking at external pay information. We focus on the nonprofit sector, and as I said, we do everything we can think of to make it as comprehensive and accurate as possible. But in some cases, it may be very much worth looking at public sector jobs. Pay for public sector jobs tends to be available publicly, sometimes on websites, though often I see, salary structures with steps that are very well defined that don't necessarily tell you what individual people are actually earning. Private sector, I think it's harder to get information on private sector pay. Certainly there are surveys, but
and that's a whole other this is a whole other webinar we can talk about. But a lot of the current debate, legislatively at least, is what is that balance with our sector workers.
It's a challenge.
All right, I'm going to keep us moving. We're not even a third of the way through, so we're going to keep moving.
Okay, turnover rates. Here again, there was a really significant change in 2022. If you look at the bottom, the increase in turnover, and 2023 was the highest we've seen for full-time and part-time employees. I want to quickly say the reason that this slide is sort of in two pieces, with the left and the right being different, is that the categories we used in the survey changed around 2016. So that's why it doesn't totally match up. So again, in 2023, the highest voluntary turnover rates reported. We do report involuntary rates as well in the survey, but it's the voluntary rates that are more concerning typically for employers. So this year we see a return to numbers that are still quite high in relation to sort of recent history and pre-pandemic history as reported on the slide, but a bit lower than last year. So again, it supports the overall picture that concern over turnover has eased somewhat in the past year, and that conditions are returning somewhat, at least, to the years immediately preceding the pandemic.
And it seems generally higher in the larger organizations for both categories on.
Yes. Yeah. And that isn't always true, but that's the pattern that we've seen in recent years. Yeah, overall. So we look at voluntary turnover factors, and the answers here depend, of course, on the person who's responding to the survey. This is a bit subjective, or I would say, it's only what this person is aware of or what their sense about it is. But still, I think it's worthwhile. So higher pay always has been the most frequently given answer since we began asking these questions. And by the way, obviously, you look at the numbers, people often give more than one answer. This year, most of these answers, the percentages are very close to what we saw in 2023. Not a big change from 2023. The last 6 lines show factors that were added as possible answers starting in 2023 based on suggestions. So we don't have information going back, though some of them are being reported by pretty significant percentage of organizations. Stress burnout, about a quarter of organizations think that they've lost employees due to stress burnout. I think people suggested this specifically relating to the challenges of dealing with the COVID-19 pandemic, especially for their frontline and program services employees. And looking at job families, sort of departments that people are finding it particularly difficult to hire for or retain employees in. Again, 2024 is very close to what we found in 2022, 2023, slightly lower in most categories on most lines. Since 2022, around half of participants reported difficulty hiring for and or retaining people in their program delivery jobs. So that's by far the most frequently chosen answer. Again, people often give more than one answer. These are most likely to be public-facing jobs and the most directly impacted by the pandemic. So half of our survey participants having some difficulty filling their and keeping people in their program services jobs. I want to say quickly that, of course, because a very wide range of organizations participate in the survey in various fields of service, what those jobs are involved in, the program delivery jobs, varies widely. So some of them are social service, some of them community organizing, they could be, arts related, any number of things, but overall, that's where the biggest challenge is. This is a question that we added this year, hearing about more organizations possibly using alternate work weeks for at least some of their employees, or an option for an alternate work week. And 14% of our survey participants indicated that they do offer an alternate work week to at least some of their employees. Again, if you look at the options we gave them specifically, they could choose more than one. 86% don't have that alternate work week policy at this point. On the left, I also wanted to include just some information about what the regular work week is for survey participants. 40 hours a week is by far the most common, but there are some organizations with a different policy.
I would say there's a couple folks inquiring just about the data. We spoke to it a little bit at the beginning. We'll speak to it at the end. But this year we had nearly 300 respondents in the Southern California region and over 700 in the north. So there's a
That's
two and a
right.
half, 2.5 times roughly what we're looking at from north to south.
That's right. We would like that to even out. We'd love
Yes,
to
we would.
keep the Northern California survey healthy and even growing, and have a broader information from Southern California as well. Living wage is something on the radar screen for many people. First, I want to sort of define it. An estimate of the local pay rate that a full-time employee requires to cover the costs of theirs or their family's basic needs where they live. So within a geographic area, whether it's county or a metropolitan area, there are different living wage numbers depending on the size of a household and the number of household members who are working. And most organizations, 80%, report that it is a strategic priority for their organization to pay employees a living wage. Now, some of these indicate that they already do, so there isn't necessarily a new budget impact, but we asked about the budget impact of that, if that goal or priority, and how they see themselves addressing it. Additional fundraising, there are various options here, and again, many people chose more than one option. I want to say quickly that the survey itself and the compensation information reported in the survey is really not reporting living wage data. It's reporting prevailing wage data for specific jobs. So we're reporting what the labor market, to the best of our ability, is overall paying for a particular job. But that isn't necessarily at the living wage level, depending on the job. There are some good sources of living wage calculations. I put the link here, example of source for living wage data. MIT has a page on their website where you can enter your location and see pretty up-to-date calculations of living wage for various sizes of households. So if you're interested, I would recommend that you look at that.
All right, let's talk about employee engagement, a rising, certainly, question.
Yes, this is a question, not surprisingly, suggested in light of the pandemic and its related challenges. So most of our survey participants are doing something about employee engagement. They could choose more than one of these. Some of them are a bit vague. Efforts to encourage positive, I'm sorry for that typo there, encourage a positive, enjoyable work environment. About 3/4 of them indicate that. Some are more specific. This is something that it'll be interesting to see as we hope the sort of acute pandemic impacts wane or evolve at least. I wouldn't be surprised if interest in employee engagement continues, though, and we'll continue to ask about it.
All right, so this is another big area, and I know there's a lot of data in the report, so we're just giving you a snapshot here. But
right,
how time off has been structured and offered is a big
right.
one.
So we have a few slides here about employee benefits, starting with paid time off, specifically whether organizations have separate categories for vacations, sick days, holidays, and sometimes that includes personal days. Or whether they combine vacation and sick into what we call PTO. So this slide shows the percentage of survey participants that do each of those two things. And then also it shows the average number of total days off given to employees in each of those two categories in their 5th year at the organization. I picked 5th year just because there wasn't a way to get a whole lot of information, more information on here, and fifth year is sort of in the middle in terms of the schedules that organizations often use to specify how much paid time off employees get. So within each of these two groups, the total number of days has been pretty consistent. And this goes way back to 2004. We do find that organizations with all the separate categories of paid time off give more days off total. So we're seeing, approximately 40-ish days off for that first group. For the second group where they do PTO, it's more like 34, 35. My guess is that PTO organizations, their employees are more likely to actually use more or all of that time off, since vacation and sick are combined, as opposed to organizations that have it separated out.
The
And
economics of that also factor in, because we get asked that often about, the pros and cons of the two structures, and just a
right.
reminder that, unused sick time is not something that is payable to a departing employee, whereas unpaid vacation is required to be. So
Right. That's a big difference. And PTO has always represented a minority of survey participants. So it was interesting to me that we saw that increase from 2004 to say 2012, 2014, and then it's fallen off some in recent years. So not a big dramatic difference, but still it looks to me that represents a not dramatic trend.
And I'm just going to time check us here. We're 10 minutes to the hour. As I said earlier, we'll probably go a little over. I can guarantee you now we will, but we will keep moving through these. And,
okay, I'm going to
have resources.
I'm going to try to not spend unnecessary time. Contribution to insurance benefits. This is as long as I've been looking at this information, it's been a challenge and concern among nonprofit employers. They really value the insurance benefits they offer and want to offer comprehensive benefits. And of course, it gets more and more expensive. So the percentage of employers who pay 100% of the monthly premium for employees has slipped just a bit, but not all that much in the past few years. The percentage that pay 100% for dependents has been relatively steady since about 2008. I want to note, though, that the actual coverage provided by these plans has changed over time. So higher copayments, higher deductibles overall. The percentage of employers offering an HSA compatible plan has gone up and down somewhat, but pretty steady recently, and it's not unusual, but it hasn't really become prevalent. I want to say one more thing quickly. In some cases, I hear that an employer may have sort of a more basic plan that they will pay 100% of for the employee. And then if the employee wants a more comprehensive plan, they will pay the difference. So that's also a factor to consider here. When we have people fill out this information, if they have, for example, more than one HMO policy, I ask them to answer the questions based on whichever HMO policy they have a higher level of enrollment in. So, this whole topic has so much potentially involved in it. We could do a whole survey just dealing with insurance benefits. But we try to get the most important information to present. And there's a lot more detail in the survey report itself.
Yeah, I'd encourage folks. I know this is the other key area that for those who wonder about what they can afford on a cash basis, that they look heavily at what's possible in the benefits side. And if you look at this, what Rita's offering here, this is this 20-year stretch. Think of all the policy changes around healthcare that have happened just in those 20 years, not to mention the prior.
Right.
All right, great. Keep it going here.
Okay, this is new-ish. Additional behavioral health benefits, again, something that I think came up related to the pandemic and all of the challenges involved in that. 8% in 2023 and also 2024 to have some additional behavioral health, mental health support benefits beyond whatever is included in their insurance policies and or an EAP. And so we also summarized here what some of those benefits reported were. It'll be interesting to see if that continues in the next several years at least.
Right. Just going back one moment, there's a question in the Q&A here. Someone sounds like surprised about the 41.4 days of vacation. That's a cumulative number.
That's
of
right.
All vacation, all holiday, personal days, sick
days. That's right. That's the total number.
Yeah, that's not 41 days of vacation as vacation.
Right. And retirement plans. So 90% of our survey participants this year in 2024 offer some kind of retirement plan. That's the highest percentage that we've seen in the survey. And among those that do, the percentage that contribute toward it has gradually increased. Again, we go back to 2004 here. However, the average percent of salary that they contribute has decreased slightly in the past several years. Most organizations do determine their contribution as a percentage of salary, and that's why that bottom line is reported. We do have some who do a flat dollar amount or do something else, but percentage of salary is by far the most common way to determine it. And it's gone down just a bit, and I don't really have much of a guess about why that would be, but 90% of organizations do offer something, and most of them, 83%, do make some sort of a contribution. Bonus incentive pay. Okay, at the top, we have some broad categories. Well, executive director, CEO, and then the categories of management staff, professional staff, support administrative staff. We've asked people, this is really a policy question. Does your organization have a policy about potential bonus incentive pay for these employees or the employees in these groups? Since 2010, it's gone up significantly. And I have to say, I don't have the numbers, but going back, way back, it wasn't something that we ever thought about. So this is something that's become more common. For executive directors, it's not quite half, but it's sort of approaching half of organizations that say they have a policy. That doesn't mean that all these people receive that kind of pay. So in the second chart, just looking at executive directors, CEOs, we see that's the second line under there, the percent that actually receive some sort of bonus or incentive pay. In recent years, it's been 20 to 31%, around 30% of the executive directors and CEOs reported in the survey actually received something. The median has been not dramatically different. The average you'll see is significantly higher than the median. The reason for that is that there's some, especially some large organizations that have this policy and have bonus incentive pay as a significant part of their executive director or CEO's compensation. And those numbers pull the average up relative to where the median is. I want to say one thing quickly. You don't have to go back to the slide. If you're thinking about adding this sort of pay to your salary administration, I want to recommend getting advice from a consultant about it who has some experience in this area so that you can design a bonus incentive plan that's going to accomplish your goals. It's really important. Okay. We always look at this. It's been really interesting over the years. In 2024, at the very bottom corner there, you'll see female executive director CEOs earn on the average 93% of what the male executive director CEOs earn. It's lower. It's not 100%. It's not more than 100%, but that's the highest overall number that we've seen if you compare it with the previous years going back to 2013. There are a couple, I think, important trends here. One, if you look at the different sizes of organizations, the pattern that we've seen very consistently over the years is that the smaller organizations are more likely to be led by women. Relatively, the largest organizations are less likely to have women as their top executive, more likely to have men. So that's very clear in 2013. And as we go through the years, that has it's still there. The pattern is still there, but it's less apparent. And starting in 2022, for the first time, we had just over 50% of the top executives at the largest organizations were women. So given that, I think that's part of why this the 93% number, that overall number percentage, the gap has narrowed over time. And also, when we look at the average women's pay as a percent of the average men's pay, you can see that it's not always the case that men are paid more or women are paid more. So what really seems to be responsible for the pay gap is not so much similar organizations paying men and women differently in this case. It's more that the women are more likely to be still at the smaller organizations, the men at the larger organizations, though that's narrowed, I think, in a really noticeable way during this time period.
And this is the Northern California data, correct?
This is Northern California. Yes,
right.
This is the one slide where it's separated out. I also want to say,
Southern
yes, we're going to look at Southern California. And in both cases, Northern and Southern, there wasn't sufficient data to include non-binary, non-conforming employees in this sort of comparison. So I just want to say that that doesn't appear here because there wasn't enough information. So in Southern California, it's a similar picture. And even the 93% is the same percent overall for 2024. A similar pattern going back of women even more likely to be leading the smaller organizations, less likely at the larger organizations, but a change in that over time. And also within each category, it's not predictable whether overall the men are paid more or the women are paid more. So the question, I mean, in one way, that seems to be a positive thing for equity considerations, that within each category, it's not always the case that men are paid more and women are paid more. On the other hand, the pattern of women being more likely to lead smaller organizations, less likely to lead larger organizations, that's sort of another question altogether.
It appears to be the bigger equity gap factor.
Right. Right.
Right. Now we're going to move from some of these larger trends now, and in our closing minutes, we're going to take a look at the actual pages in the survey. For those of you familiar with the survey, this will look very familiar. For those of you not, we think this is a very valuable thing for folks to have a sense of how to read the data, because it is hundreds and hundreds of pages of data when you look at these final reports. I do want to look. There's a question that's been repeated in the Q&A that goes back to the COLA question, and it's around source data for decision making around a COLA. And do we know what executive managers are looking at when they determine their rates of increase?
That's a really good question, and it's something that the survey doesn't ask. So it asks, do you have a policy about looking at COLA data to inform your decisions? And if so, what increases are you giving related to COLA? But it doesn't ask what data you're looking at.
You don't know what?
No, I can't.
Well, we always, and we'll end on this too, but there, a lot of these questions, as Rita shared, have been suggested by readers and users over the years. So
yes.
That Rita's always open to new things we want to know.
I rely on your suggestions to keep this relevant for people.
All right, so let's take a look at some of these pages and get a sense of how to use them. We've selected just a few jobs that are some of the most commonly asked about when people call or email in. And we're going to take a look at what these data pages look like.
Right, so this is the format. And I want to quickly just say the lines at the top, it's covered a bit by the arrow. It says annual cash compensation. Those first 4 lines deal with the sample as a whole, every organization that reported someone in this job, and then across what the base pay numbers, compiled numbers were, how many of them say that this person could be eligible for incentive or bonus pay, and then how many of them actually received pay and how much that pay was compiled. And then the total cash compensation, that line adds the base and any bonus incentive pay for each individual person and runs those calculations again. So the first columns, I mean, number of organizations, number of employees, I think that's clear. 10th percentile through 90th percentile, median is the same as the 50th. To calculate those numbers, we take the individual salary numbers, and those are not averages from an organization. We ask for individual people's numbers. We don't care about their names, but we want them listed as individuals so that we can calculate more accurate percentiles. So to get the percentiles, we line them up from the lowest to the highest, and we pick the one at a particular position. So median means you pick the one in the middle. 10th percentile means you pick the one 10% of the way from the bottom to the top. So it's not the lowest number, but it's on the low side of this sample. Similarly, 90th percentile is not the highest number, but it's on the high side. The percentiles are meant to give you a sense of how the data is distributed. So let's see, I talked about that. And then below those first 4 lines, we get into the breakouts. And this is just for illustration, so you don't see them all. Annual expenses, geographic location. This page was taken from Northern California. So then we have for the specific data line under annual expenses or under location, the calculations are made. So there are 2 average employee lines. One looks at the individual employees, and the one on the right-hand side, average by organization, that treats each organization equally, regardless of how many people they reported in this job. And the reason for that is to get an average number that isn't significantly impacted by what potentially just one organization might do if they happen to have a whole lot of people in this particular job compared with other organizations. So that's what this is.
All right, let's look at some geographic distribution too.
Quickly. Okay, I want to say first, these are not the result of a definitive study or a regression analysis. They're calculated by looking at the average pay for specific jobs in the survey's geographic location categories and comparing those pay numbers with the survey overall. But I do think it's worthwhile to get at least a general idea about the differences, and might be helpful if you're looking at compensation information for jobs that don't have all those geographic category lines reported, because sometimes we don't get enough data to report them. So for Northern California, I often suggest that people in the Bay Area look at that Bay Area number, which includes the 6 counties under it. You can look at the specific county, but the Bay Area is pretty cohesive in terms of an employment market, and having more data is useful. There's an advantage in having more data. So in Northern California, beyond the Bay Area, Central Coast, Napa, Solano, Sonoma, Sacramento, they're lower than the Bay Area. They aren't too far apart from each other. Central Valley is lower, and then North Coast and Sierra Nevada North State are lower. So none of this is surprising. This is, as I said, it's not meant to be really definitive, but to give you an idea of the differences. In Southern California, our geographic categories are closer together, and I don't know if I do this again next year or with in a different survey year, maybe it will come out somewhat differently. Los Angeles is a bit higher than the others. That's what I would expect, I guess. Though I know there are some other areas in Southern California where pay is probably very similar to Los Angeles. In this case, there might be more of an urban-rural situation. So for example, my impression is Santa Barbara, northern Santa Barbara, might be more like San Luis Obispo and Kern, for example. So these categories by county, it's the way we've done the survey breakout. It might be really useful to also do a rural-urban breakout in addition. That's something that I would think about doing, but this is what we've got for now.
Right. So we're going to take a quick look at some of these other more common requests we get for specific jobs. All of this and much more are in the full report, but let's take a
Right.
look at a couple of these.
Okay, good. This is where we start. So the executive director, CEO in Southern California, this illustrates the degree to which the pay for this job and other executive level jobs tracks really strongly with the size of the organization, whether you're looking at the annual expenses or over on the right, the number of FTEs. Those are two ways of looking at the size. And there's a very clear relationship, certainly in the executive level jobs. The location is worth considering as well. In Southern California, we find it's not as significant. Field of service tells you something about the kind of organizations that make up this data sample, but with a few exceptions, I don't find that pay levels track very reliably with the field of service. It's there again to give you a sense of who are these organizations, what kind of organizations contributed this data. So I wouldn't generally recommend that you try to necessarily formulate pay decisions based on that. There are other things that are more important.
So let's take a look at Director of Development. We'll look at the Northern California snapshot here.
Right. So again, the director level jobs, pay levels do tend to track with the size of the organization, whether annual expenses or the number of FTEs. It doesn't, the variation is not as wide as what we just saw in the executive director CEO job, but it's certainly still there. There is in Northern California a big difference in pay depending on geographic area. Field of service again may be interesting for context. The number of employees managed is relevant for this job, and so as expected, pay is higher for employees that have more significant supervisory responsibility.
Getting runaway slides here.
Southern California program manager. So manager level job, the size of the organization doesn't strongly track with pay levels. There are some differences between geographic areas, but not terribly significant in this group.
Okay.
And administrative assistant, intermediate level. This is a job we get a lot of data for. There's some difference. There we go. Some difference in pay based on organization size, but it's not altogether predictable. There are significant differences based on geography. In general, I would say if you're looking at a page and you think, gee, does it matter how big my organization is? If there's enough data to report so that we fill in these lines for expenses and number of FTEs, you can see whether that's a factor by looking at the numbers. Does it track with the size? If it does, then it's worth considering. If it really doesn't, then not so important.
All right, so looking ahead, these are some of the things I know that have been already asked of you. But let's talk about this, Rita. What do you want to hear from folks today and in the next few weeks or months?
I really do. Again, I know I've said this, value suggestions. We've gotten suggestions that are in my notes: tuition reimbursement, student loan debt repayment. One important thing that's a goal of mine for the survey is to add an online query function so that people can search for multiple parameters. For example, for a particular job, look at location and financial size at the same time. I know that would be really useful. I've gotten questions about staffing levels for example, HR and IT. How many HR employees do you have? And how does that relate to the overall size of your organization? For example, we always are interested in hearing about jobs that aren't covered well by the survey. Sometimes organizations have really specialized jobs that I'm afraid if we added would not get enough of a response because we need a threshold of distinct organizations to report them in order to have it in the survey report itself. But when you have a job that really isn't covered, I appreciate hearing about it. And anything else that anybody thinks would be interesting.
Thanks, Rita. As we close out here, I just want to make one more pitch that the more we have respondents to these surveys, the more powerful they are, the more information there is. I will tell you, in now knowing that it's been 4 decades of work that Rita's put into this, that she's been very responsive, and her team has certainly taken a look at all of these suggestions as they come in where possible. But above all, just to have more people. I shared earlier, and I'll share again, we haven't quite hit 300 in Southern California in this last year's survey. We're over 7 and approaching 8 in the Northern California survey. We want to keep those numbers high, but the Southern California folks in particular, we'd love to grow that as the newer, younger survey in parity with the Northern California survey. And all of these, and we didn't get a time to really have much of an additional conversation on some of these questions. I was able to throw in some, but we are capturing all of these. I know Robert is always committed to following up. And of course, those of you that have not used the survey, it is available. Some of you are wondering how it's accessed. You know, Robert answered a lot of those in writing during the session today, but this is a service, but it is for fee. There are discounts for participants, and that's one of the great incentives of participating, is that you can then access the final data for less. I will share that Rita and I are having a loose and slowly we're working on a conversation on how we could wrap this into CalNonprofits membership. So you know, we want to support her and her team for doing this work, and the actual product of the survey is the primary way they do that. But there may be some ways in the future that we'll work out so that folks can have more access, because of course that is why we do this. So I'm going to give the last word to you, Rita, and then we'll pass it back to Robert to close this out.
Oh, well, thank you very much. I just really appreciate so much being able to do this with you all today. I recognize some survey names as people were joining, survey participant names. Our survey participants are what make this possible. So thank you for your interest in the survey, your willingness to participate, enter your information. We're very, very grateful.
Right. All right, we'll leave these on the screen. And thank you so much, Rita, for not only your work and joining us today, but you know, the years and years you put into this and the expertise that you share with us. So I'll toss it back to Robert now. Thank you so much.
Thanks so much, Geoff and Rita. What an information-packed session we had there. Covered a lot of ground in a short period of time. Really appreciative of the folks that were able to stay on and join us for the last 15 minutes. As a reminder, everyone will be receiving a recording of the webinar, as well as our slides and answers to any of the questions that we were unable to address during the presentation. Also, please feel free to reach out to us at events@CalNonprofits or to Geoff and Rita for specific questions, particularly around accessing and receiving the full compensation survey report. So thanks again for joining us. We look forward to hosting you and having you at another CalNonprofits webinar. Have a great rest of your afternoon. Take care.